This lecture provides a case study of a currency union by looking at the euro. Our primary focus so far has been on understanding how exchange rates are determined and how changes in the exchange rate in turn can impact an economy. All of this has assumed that the exchange rate is indeed flexible and therefore responsive to changes. Even when we looked at fixed exchange rate regimes, the basic understanding here, as it is in practice, is that there are always forces that impact on the exchange rate, but that the country intervenes in the foreign exchange market to manipulate the rate so that it remains at some predetermined level if the desired peg is to be defended. We however now want to look explicitly at the most extreme form of a fixed exchange rate regime, which is a currency union. We shall do this through a case study of the euro. A currency union is an extreme fixed exchange rate regime where participating countries replace their national currencies with a single common currency. Some examples of currency unions in existence today include the euro, the CFA franc, and the East Caribbean dollar. We will focus on the euro. The euro is the common currency used by the group of countries referred to as the Eurozone or Eurozone countries. So we will interchangeably use the euro and the Eurozone to refer to the currency union or monetary union to which they belong. The euro as a currency union was established on January 1st, 1999 with 11 nations. It has since grown to 19 nations as of January 1st, 2016. The origins of the euro date well back to the Marshall Plan that was put in place to facilitate the reconstruction of war-torn Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. However, more explicit origins of the vision of the euro as a currency union date to the 1992 Maastricht Treaty signed by member nations of the European Communities. The treaty included an economic and monetary union project that would, among other things, lead to the establishment of a European Central Bank to manage the establishment of a currency union for member states. In 1999, the euro was introduced as a unit of account, and in 2002, euro notes and coins were introduced and replaced national currencies of member nations of the Eurozone. It should be understood that the euro is not the currency of the member nations of the European Union, but only of a subset of the European Union, the countries which make up the Eurozone. The European Union, the EU, which is a much larger partnership, is an economic as well as political partnership among member nations designed to foster economic cooperation, mutual prosperity, and peaceful coexistence. While the euro is envisioned as the currency that would ultimately be adopted by the entire EU membership, there is provision in the varied treaties that allow each country to determine its level of integration. This is the principle of variable geometry. It allows members of the EU decide on their own the level of integration they have within the EU, which would include whether they would be willing to join the euro as the Eurozone countries have. So while there are currently 28 nations in the EU, only 19 are within the euro. It should also be noted that joining the euro is also not automatic, as there are certain conditions that a country wishing to join the euro must meet, the so-called convergence criteria, in order to allow for a smooth process that does not destabilize or upend the currency union. Let us look closely at the convergence criteria, as it's an important set of requirements that lies at the heart of building a stable currency union. The convergence criteria involves would-be members converging on 5 key areas, which are on exchange rates, inflation rates, long-term nominal interest rates, government deficits, and the government debt. It should be noted that the United Kingdom and Denmark which are not members of the Euro, have opt-out agreements under the Maastricht Treaty. Other members of the EU are expected to work toward adopting the Euro. So let us look at each of these criteria. Prior to the establishment of the Euro, would-be members were supposed to join what's called an exchange rate mechanism, the ERM, where they were expected to peg their currencies to each other over a period of time as a precursor phase to test the viability of operating a currency union, which is an irrevocable peg by design. The second phase of the ERM, now in operation, is a post-Euro phase, where new members are supposed to join the ERM for 2 years by pegging to the Euro and remaining within the specified band satisfactorily. Successfully doing so would mean adopting the Euro afterward should not lead to any instability in either country or the other Eurozone countries. The inflation rate convergence requirement states that a country must have an inflation rate close to that of the 3 lowest inflation countries in the Eurozone. This is intended to go hand in hand with successfully remaining in the ERM, since by design, under relative PPP, a peg would suggest that inflation differentials between a country and the average inflation rate in the Eurozone would be close to zero. The explicitness of the criteria, though, is to ensure that the country takes steps to remove any inflation bias that might be hidden in its economic fundamentals, which might come to fore after joining the Eurozone and create instability in the currency union. On this slide, I have demonstrated the close relationship this criteria has with that of the exchange rate convergence for Hungary. The third nominal convergence criteria, which again goes hand in hand with the other two, is the long-run interest rate convergence. This states formally that a country must have a long-term interest rate close to that in the 3 low inflation countries. Note that this is the long-run interest rate, which is determined by the Fisher equation, and which suggests that in the lowest inflation states, for any given level of real interest rates, the nominal interest rates also would be the lowest ones, or the ones closest to the real interest rate. And recall, the real interest rate measures the true cost of borrowing. As demonstrated here with the Hungarian interest rate and inflation rates, by relative PPP and UIP, the inflation differential between the Eurozone and Hungary should be equal to the interest rate differential between the two. So minimal divergence in inflation rates should also be seen in minimal divergence in interest rates. The criteria, however, is made explicit in order to ensure again that there is no latent inflation in the joining economy that would have the effect of raising average inflation rates in the Eurozone after its entry. There is also a government deficit criteria that has to be met. This requirement is that a country should not have a deficit in any year that's greater than 3% of its GDP, both prior to joining and even after entry. A related final criteria is the government debt criteria, which requires that a country not have a debt to GDP ratio greater than 60% at any time, both prior to joining and after entry in the currency union. As already stated, the rationale for the 3 nominal convergence criteria are to address the credibility problem associated with inflationary bias. The credibility problem arises when a government with control over monetary policy can use it at its discretion to temporarily boost the economy, which it might do in an election year, but which ultimately leads to inflation and hurts the economy afterwards, but after it has secured enough popularity in order to win the election. By requiring convergence on these 3 variables, any country wanting to join the Euro needed to demonstrate that it had overcome the credibility problem by eliminating any inflationary bias in its pre-membership monetary policies. The rationale for fiscal discipline, that is, for convergence on deficits and debt, is also in the same spirit. Inflation could result from lack of fiscal discipline as the government runs up deficits and result in debt. There are problems usually with this. One problem is that the debt may force monetization. That is, the situation where the European Central Bank is forced to purchase the government debt that is issued directly. While this is unlikely given that the ECB under the Maastricht Treaty is explicitly forbidden from doing so, it however might be forced to do this if not doing so might lead to a breakup of the euro. But why would it get to that point? Well, this is the second problem. When one particular country has a very high debt to GDP ratio, to be able to borrow it must pay a higher interest rate to account for this. Interest rate differentials within a currency union could lead to instability as interest rates tend to move together within a country. So what started in the fiscal realm now moves over to the nominal realm and we have instability setting in. So the convergence criteria is intended to ensure that the currency union remains viable and stable as it expands its membership. Now that we have a little bit of history and the practical requirements intended to make the euro as a currency union work, let us take a look at the economic logic of currency unions in general. The theoretical lens we shall use for this is the theory of optimum currency areas. The logic of an optimum currency area, or an OCA, is that for all member nations, joining is optimal insofar as the benefits it brings about exceeds the costs associated with being a part of it. So what are the benefits membership of an OCA bring? The benefits are those that come from increased market integration and the absence of exchange rate risk. These would therefore be lower transaction costs and reduced uncertainty in international transactions. Where these are reduced, the volume of such mutually beneficial transactions would be greater, and so welfare is increased for member nations. But what are the costs? The costs are seen largely in the form of stability costs. Joining an OCA assumes that a single centralized monetary authority will oversee monetary policy. But what if countries within the OCA are very different, such that they respond to shocks differently? How does the monetary authority act in such a situation where helping one country puts another in potential jeopardy? In other words, there will be stability costs that grow exponentially the more different countries are, and the sacrifice of independent monetary policy becomes very costly in such situations where they are needed but cannot be implemented. Depicted on this slide is the symmetry integration diagram that shows where, given the degree of symmetry in shocks and market integration, a particular country should choose an exchange rate regime that will be optimal in balancing associated costs against benefits. As seen, if the symmetry of the shocks is low and markets are not that much integrated, which happens below the red fixed line, it is optimal for a country in that area vis-a-vis the other country or countries to float its currency. Above the red line, there is a higher degree of symmetry in response to shocks and also a fairly high degree of market integration happening. Therefore, operating a fixed exchange rate regime becomes desirable at this point. The extreme form of that regime would be a currency union, which would now be optimal if both symmetry of shocks and market integration were still much higher, resulting in a country finding itself above the orange OCA line. In such a situation, the benefits of a common currency now dominate any costs, as stability costs are minimized from greater symmetry between the country and the other countries it has dealings with. So given this, is there really an economic logic for the existence of the euro? The general feeling of economists at the time was no. The feeling was more that while Eurozone countries may have been above the fixed line, they were not all above the OCA line. The reasons advanced for this feeling include the following. First, that the only countries with any semblance of similarities in their economies were perhaps Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Austria, and Germany. This means stability costs are high for countries currently in the Eurozone. Second, that their labor markets were not well integrated, and labor immobility in the Eurozone still persists. Labor market mobility may help mitigate stability costs as an adjustment mechanism for any particular economy. Third, the absence of fiscal transfers, which would also have been another adjustment mechanism to counter dissimilarities across countries in the presence of asymmetric shocks, keeps the stability costs high in the Eurozone. Finally, the countries within the Eurozone have differing opinions on inflation, as is observed within their economies, even though they might have met with the nominal convergence criteria. This creates tension with respect to how the Common Central Bank, the ECB, might operate in practice, especially if low inflation rate countries are loath to have it carry out any form of monetary easing to help stabilize the economies of members facing recessions, as this might lead to higher average inflation in the Eurozone. In thinking then why countries somewhat aware of these glaring limitations still proceeded to form the euro, we turn now to ask what the political logic might have been. The politics in this case has roots in history. Without going into the politics of conflict, it is plausible to think that the history of continued conflict and war that had come to plague Western Europe was not a desirable equilibrium for these countries. And with the increasing threat of communism from the East, there was some sense that greater economic cooperation and integration might be one way to mitigate these problems and potential threats. As a further impetus towards this, the Marshall Plan that was put in place to rebuild their economies required a significant amount of economic coordination and cooperation for its success. The adoption of a single currency in this sense may be seen as one part of the overall logic for political survival by first achieving full economic and monetary integration. This is perhaps the raison d'etre for the currency union, and as we shall hint at later, might also be a reason why it might not last. Okay, so the euro exists as of today and has done so for over a decade now. How does the euro operate in practice? As the currency of the Eurozone, its overall level of supply is determined by the European Central Bank, the ECB. The ECB was created in 1998 and is headquartered in Frankfurt, Germany. So let's take a closer look at the ECB. In terms of the governance of the ECB, we will highlight two: the structure and decision-making process, and the checks and balances that exist in its operation. First, in looking at its structure and decision-making process, the ECB has at its apex the Governing Council, which is made up of all the central bank governors of each of the member nations of the Eurozone, and the 6 members of the Executive Board, one of whom is further appointed as the President of the ECB. Meetings are held twice a month, and policy decisions are made by consensus. In terms of the checks and balances for the ECB's operation within the EU, and in relation to member nation governments, the ECB is designed to be functionally independent of all of them in setting monetary policy and fulfilling its mandate. The members of the Executive Board, though appointed by the European Council, once appointed, have security of tenure. The ECB, under the treaty that created it, has a primary goal of maintaining price stability in the euro area. It also has a secondary goal of supporting the general economic policies in the community. In the conduct of monetary policy, its policy instrument is the interest rate at which banks borrow funds. This is the key instrument it influences by altering the levels or growth rates of money supply. Unlike the US Fed, that has similar goals and instruments, the ECB cannot act as a lender of last resort. But similar to the Fed, it cannot bail out member states or governments, and it cannot directly finance member states' fiscal deficits. One interesting observation about the ECB is that it was patterned in large part after the German central bank, which had a strong reputation for fighting inflation effectively. The inflation rate target set by the ECB is somewhere close to 2%. The ECB aggressively seeks to keep inflation below this, but has no stated policy on how to counter deflation, or how it might seek to pursue full employment in member states. It's therefore thought that the ECB is obsessed too much with inflation to the neglect of other perhaps equally important policy objectives, and that this might prove its undoing, as came close to happening in the wake of the sovereign debt crisis that threatened to break up the euro recently. So in light of this, it's a good time for us to ask how the euro has performed as a currency union. We address this through answering the following. Has the ECB been successful in meeting its mandate? Is there now more consensus that the existence of the euro has moved member states above the OCA line? Is the ongoing requirement of fiscal discipline still being met by member states? And importantly as well, how well did the Eurozone weather the impacts of the Great Recession? In meeting stated objectives, the answer is that it appears to have done this with respect to price stability. But in terms of the secondary goal of supporting member states' economic goals, the answer is probably no. Is the economic logic for its existence being satisfied? Here the answer is not particularly clear. Cultural, economic, and even political differences are still glaring, and these keep stability costs high. This also restricts alternative adjustment mechanisms from being put in place to help mitigate these costs. Further, it was later found out that some countries had falsified their data in order to meet the convergence criteria, and this was found out after they had joined, so that the resulting instability that comes from lack of such true convergence has been threatening to break up the euro through forcing the ejection of these countries out of the euro. Has the fiscal discipline requirement continued to be met? The answer here is no. In addition to some countries that, as mentioned earlier, having falsified their data, even the dominant stable countries in the Eurozone have found it difficult to rein in government spending. And while the Stability and Growth Pact put in place in 1997 was designed to ensure compliance with this ongoing requirement, in practice it has been weak in enforcing any type of compliance. How did the Eurozone weather the Great Recession? Here is where it performed poorly, in that its reaction was very slow and somewhat late. This has been explained already as due to the fact that full employment as a policy objective is not a high priority for the ECB. It actually had to take the euro to get to the brink of a possible breakup for the ECB president to state that the ECB would take any steps required to prevent this. Interestingly, markets took that as credible enough, and the pressures towards chaos were mitigated. However, what we see was while the US was able to emerge from the Great Recession by 2010, the Eurozone suffered a double-dip recession in 2011 to 2013, with unemployment rates among hardest-hit member states averaging above 20%. We now ask what the future might hold for the euro going forward. Well, for optimists, it will persist, and their reasons are either due to the political logic or the fact that the currency as well as the union still has very strong global clout. For pessimists, on the other hand, though, they see the euro as a failed experiment that will soon unravel. They point to the fact that the original political logic is no longer present, and that the economic rationale is still not satisfied. Further, there has been growing disenchantment from publics whose governments have been forced to implement austerity measures as a condition of obtaining monetary aid packages from the EU, IMF and ECB. This sense of individual sovereignty and self-determination seems to be growing stronger than the need for integration into a body that seems disconnected to their individual interests, such that the pessimists believe that the euro will ultimately break up as some member states choose to reinstate their autonomy over monetary policy. To conclude, the euro serves up an interesting experiment that ultimately says that it's always important not to overlook the economic dimension. More generally, satisfying the OCA criteria might be crucial for long-term stability of any currency union. Further, if the euro is to succeed as optimists hope for, it may be necessary for the ECB to pay closer attention to other objectives beyond price stability, for the economically stronger states to make financial sacrifices perhaps through looser monetary policy in order to accommodate the interests of the weaker states, and for member states to consider the possibility of greater fiscal integration or to have some form of fiscal transfer mechanism in place as a buffer in light of asymmetric shocks to the Eurozone member nations. We are now done with this course. Take the quiz associated with this lecture and, well, get ready to take the final exam.